Hello there, I'm Tony Harris.
And I'm Paul Howarth,
Welcome to the Twilight Turntable,
where we encourage you to revive the lost art of listening.
one late night long player at a time. Hello, Paul.
Hello there, Tone. How are you?
I'm very good, thank you. What fettle yourself?
Very, very well indeed. Here we are again at the Twilight Turntable. They said it wouldn't last.
Here we are. I know. And what a lovely appointment it is in my diary.
Indeed, indeed.
And for those of you who don't know what on earth we mean by the Twilight Turntable, allow me to explain. The inspiration for this comes from the fact that of an evening, instead of staying up with my eyes glued to the TV or my mobile phone, I instead sit down and play vinyl, I should point out, a long player and listen to it on both sides with nothing but the cover and sleeve notes to entertain me during that. And I just listen. That's why we call this about reviving the lost art of listening, because to be honest, I think a lot of the time we tend to treat music as a soundtrack to something else we're doing. And I thought it'd be quite nice to try and start to convert people back to the old joys of listening to music for the sake of just listening to the music.
Yeah.
And who better as my first convert and disciple than my old friend and colleague, Mr. Howarth here. So every episode I choose a long player that I think he might like, but has probably not had anything like the exposure to that I might have done.
Mm-hmm.
And on we go, which is the premise of what we're going to listen to for the next however many minutes we manage to ramble on for.
There'll be a little bit of boffing.
There may be some boffing.
So this is now episode 2 of the Twilight Turntable, and we're delighted that we've had some great response from all of you out there who've listened to the first episode, which is on the Kinks. Tone, I think you've had a couple of people you wanted to name check.
Yeah, I'd like to thank everybody who's downloaded and got involved so far. You can visit our Facebook page. I've been loading up various vinyls for you to have a look at for anybody who is remotely interested, and I think we'll have some T-shirts later. But I do want to say to my mum, I will try and less. And there you go, straight in. And we did set the Twilight tidbit, if you remember, of albums that began with a telephone ringing. And I'd like to give a shout out to my old friend, Paul Ging, who's out in Doha. And he also has a fantastic blog called This Bit's Brilliant, in which he and his compadres review various sports and music books. And they read various passages from that, and it's very, very entertaining. So that's This Bit's Brilliant. Anyway, the tidbit was the album that he reminded me of, and I should have remembered it, but was Setting Suns by The Jam, and their opening track, Girl on the Phone. Clues in the title. We should have got that, shouldn't we?
Nice one, Paul. Thanks for being there.
Thank you, Paul. We hope you're still listening. So without further ado, and obviously on the basis that one day I think this will ever turn up on film, I'm holding up to the camera Paul's homework for this week, which is from 1983.
Yep.
Aztec camera, Highland Hard Rain, and that's in a lovely Japanese original pressing, by the way. So, Paul, as ever, my question is, did you like it?
I liked it very much. Thank you, Tone. I was familiar with one track. So like with the Kinks last time, I'd only heard Sunny Afternoon. With Highland Hard Rain, I'd only heard Oblivious.
I see you crying and I want to kill your friends. I hear your footsteps in the street, won't be long before we it's obvious. Just count me in, count me out, I'll be waiting for the shot.
Which is the first track on the album, which is one of the singles from the album.
It is indeed.
But apart from that, I was listening to everything afresh, as if anew, 40 plus years on. Yeah, I liked it. The first thing I noticed actually was the title of the album, Highland Hard Rain, which is actually a lyric from one of the other tracks on the album, The Boy Wonders. We might have a quick chat at the end of this episode, Tone, about other albums that take their titles from a track on that album, but are not named after the title of that track. Does that make sense?
It does indeed. I suspect for the listeners out there, you will hear a low whirring during the whole of this episode, because that'll be my brain trying to work a few out to come up with at the end.
A thrum
A
of
thrum.
activity.
So I'm
yeah,
pleased you enjoyed this. The Pride of East Kilbride, as he was known. It's funny. I have a very dear friend who lives in Australia who is a huge Aztec camera fan.
oh yeah,
And he lived in East Kilbride, and he was very proud of the fact that Roddy Frame lived there. So,
oh no, and I like that. Wherever you're from, I think it's always nice to see people from that area do well. But back to this album, we'll talk about the music, of course, in a moment. But one thing that I was particularly sort of fascinated by is that Roddy Frame, who I'm sure many people are pretty familiar with, he was but 18/19 when he was writing, recording, and releasing this album, which seems incredibly callow to me. And then when I was doing a bit of reading around the subject, as I like to do, he was only 15 when he wrote the track "We Could Send Letters," which I just find astonishing, that someone could write something so deep and meaningful and tuneful and beautiful at such a tender age. So, he's definitely something of a boy wonder himself, wasn't he?
he certainly was. And I'm going to just give you a little of my personal background to why I selected this, because I have to say, this is one of my real favorite albums. Now, they say there is a theory that you always think the greatest year in music is around your 17th, 18th birthday.
Yeah.
And this comes in between my 17th and 18th birthday. And I remember it coming out originally as a indie release, and we'll talk about that later, no doubt. And then appearing on Top of the Pops around November.
Yeah.
And I went and bought this album, and I absolutely loved it, and I still do, and it has that sort of resonance. You talk about him being sort of 18, 19. He's a year older than I am when I buy the record for the first time, and my affection for it is, and perhaps it comes from the fact that sometimes I like to think of myself as a hopeless romantic too, or most would consider me romantically hopeless, but it just absolutely cut to what I wanted to think about and how you saw through life. And of course I couldn't express it in anything like the way that he was able to, but there's a real magic to it, and that magic is still there through the fact that I can transport myself back to being, I can see where I was. The whole thing is there. And that's why I selected. So it's an album that I have more than just a little affection for. I mean, I truly love this album. It's one of them that I, will listen to time and time and time again, never cease from enjoying. And so the fact that you said you seem to quite enjoy it is something that I feel a tremendous sense of relief about, because I would have been absolutely devastated if you hadn't liked it.
You mustn't feel relieved about my silly old opinion, but I more than quite liked it. I really liked it, and one of the things that as you listen to the album, and of course I can never have that same relationship with it because I was listening to it now, a man in his 50s now, listening as a tired, careworn. But actually, when you listen to it, the whole album has this incredible sort of juxtaposition between sometimes quite jaunty, tuneful jangle pop, the likes of Oblivious or Pillar to Post, another great track on the album, or Walk Out to Winter, which is another single, I think. But yes, juxtaposed with a real sense of poignancy, of loss, of trauma that maybe he was going through at the time, Roddy, when he wrote this stuff. And sometimes you get that juxtaposition in the same song. So if you're listening to Oblivious, which appears to be fairly light alternative pop, a great pop song, and it's bouncing along, and then you hear the line, "I hear you crying and I want to kill your friends." You think, hang on, this doesn't quite fit. Or you're listening to Pillar to Post, which is another beautiful jaunty tune, and then you get lyrics like "the salted taste of all your tears and woes," and you think, hang on a minute, it really takes you aback. Or you get something in "We Could Send Letters," which is to say he was 15. I found some blood I wasn't meant to find. I think, Christ, what world are we in here? So,
Well, they do talk about this having a sense of leaving and departure, because I
yeah.
think he knew he was going to move
Hmm.
south to pursue his musical career, and a sort of sense of leaving his, his hometown of East Kilbride. And, and I think that does sort of permeate the whole album. And yet it is set to some of the, most positive sounding
Yes.
um tunes that you can, I'd ever, and certainly at that stage had ever heard. And this was, there wasn't much that sounded like this at the time. You've got to remember that. This is,
Well, I sort of got that when I listened to it, even at 40 years distance. I thought the Kinks' Face to Face was the first album we looked at last time, wasn't it? And it was quite I hugely enjoyed that album, by the way. I think it's absolutely brilliant. But I thought it was quite straightforward to pick out its influences and the things that it went on to influence. With this, I found it more difficult. I mean, you hear, I'm going to come on to talk a bit about the incredible kind of Spanish guitar playing that Roddy
incredible, isn't it? It is incredible, isn't it?
Yeah. So stuff like that, I'm not aware of that being a thing in pop music at the time. I'm sure there were some people doing it, or he must have been inspired by some guitar heroes, but it wasn't. It doesn't feel to me so linear as maybe the Kinks one was. Or you hear, I don't know, little echoes of what might become a sort of a Johnny Marr type guitar sound in a track like "Walk Out to Winter," for example. And by the way, if he did have anything to do with inspiring Johnny Marr and the Smiths and that guitar sound, then you really have to doff your cap to him, I think.
Listen, there is absolutely no doubt that Johnny Marr saw Roddy Frame as a prototype. If you look at early Johnny, the suede jackets, the Ray-Ban shades, the kind of sort of 60s left bank Paris sort of arty look.
Yeah.
Johnny Marr took that up completely. And actually, there's a reason behind that as well, is that, we talk about indie.
Yeah.
And Aztec Camera, actually, if you listen to the album, it doesn't sound like what we now think of an indie album as sounding, because it's always quite dark and a bit moody and a bit alternative. But this was alternative at the time. It was on, originally they were on Postcard, which was a Scottish label by which had also produced Orange Juice and
right.
Joseph K. And they then went to Rough Trade, which is where this album was first released and the singles were first released. But clearly they were a new sound, so they were indie because they were on an independent label.
Yeah,
and so they were very popular with the indie charts. But that didn't mean that they necessarily broke into the mainstream charts, because they were selling in very different ways. What happens is that Aztec Camera get onto the radar of the main record labels. There's a bit of a bidding war, and they signed to WEA, to Warner's.
Yeah.
And there is a story of almost Roddy Frame and the Smiths passing each other in Rough Trade lobby.
Oh, I like to think that happened.
As they've just told Rough Trade that they're leaving to go to Warner's.
Yeah.
And Jeff Travis clearly not happy about that, because this is sort of, he's hoping is the goose that lays the golden egg.
Yeah.
Then signs the Smiths and is very, very certain that he will never let them go, as he doesn't until they've split up, long gone on. And of course, they themselves sell their back catalogue to Warner's as well.
Oh, did they?
in the early 90s.
Oh, funny.
But it's interesting, that whole thing of, we talk about it didn't sound like anything else. I mean, I remember when Oblivious made it to Top of the Pops, and I looked this up to check. It's 1 week before the Smiths go on to do This Charming Man for the first time.
With the gladioli.
With the gladioli. And there's this sort of very interesting concept of what was indie music. Indie music was on an indie label.
Yes.
It didn't have to be dark and miserable. It didn't have to be necessarily even that alternative. What it was an alternative to is the music that tended to be in the charts at the time, which was bright, shiny. There was a lot of synth music going on.
Yes.
And it was often seen as, and that's often why indie music has a slight political vibe that goes through it. It's part of the persona. And you hear it a little bit in here. And actually, Roddy Frame was a big supporter of Red Wedge.
Mm-hmm.
And it's sort of the music of the upwardly mobile tended to be Duran Duran and the shiny synth bands, even though they were actually no less, they were from all from the same kind of background.
Working class backgrounds,
Yeah, they all just had a very different kind of sound. Whereas these sort of guitar bands and lyricists almost as poets, and there's a few of those we can talk about at the time. Lloyd Cole, who I know is a big favorite of yours.
Yeah.
And clearly I think is influenced by this album.
Yeah.
And my favorite of the time, which is Paddy McAloon and Prefab Sprout, who come out at the same time as this.
Yeah.
They're on the Kitchenware label, which is in Newcastle.
Yeah.
And there's this sort of odd alternativeness. So that's why, in songs like Release, you hear about the red flag and storming the palace. In Oblivious, you've got wear different badges, but they wear them just the same.
Yeah.
There is this sort of odd, a little bit of a sort of political thing going on in it, because it was part of the persona of being an indie band, was that you were the representative of that sort of outlier audience rather than the mainstream.
Yes.
And that's really what they were.
And there's definitely that political thread that you mentioned there. Then it was funny because I read something that Roddy Frame had said, which is that he never really felt that comfortable writing and singing about political issues, although clearly he did touch on it. And I think that might have been in the context of maybe Billy Bragg, who clearly has made a whole career out of that. But again, since I mentioned Billy Bragg, there's a little bit of sort of steel string guitar sound, particularly on the track Back on Board, which is a bit reminiscent of how Billy Bragg sounded at the time.
And Down the Dip, which is the closing song, is straight out of the Billy Bragg playbook.
I've got all the love and beauty in the spirit of the night, and I'm holding my ticket tight. Stupidity and suffering are on that ticket too, but I'm going down the dip with you. Swear I'm such, but then I'm tired.
And I was sort of, as I said with the Kinks, it was kind of really obvious, not in a bad way, but it was kind of obvious where they'd come from and where they were going to. With this, it was much less straightforward. I did, listening again just now, actually, to We Could Send Letters. There's a bit of bass in that is a bit almost like The Cure. That sort of troubling bass line that you get a lot in The Cure.
Well, I just while we're on We Could Send Letters, I mean, he sees that very much. He saw that very much as the centerpiece of the album. It's actually quite long. It's nearly 6 minutes long.
I didn't really realize it was that long. It's just it's just really enjoyable.
It was an early B-side that was reworked. I find it shimmering, that song. But what I also love about it, and this is where the 17-year-old me is going to speak to you, because there's a sort of the idea of when you wanted to start a romance, as it were, was that you send letters. I was away, and like you'd meet somebody if you're on holiday, or you'd say, "Can I write to you?" And I love that. Now you send a text with an aubergine probably, or something like that. Whereas actually you sat down, and I've got all my letters that I was ever sent when I was away at college or at school and stuff like that. And I sort of really like that. And I think it's one of the things that sort of dates it a little bit.
Yeah.
But sort of dates it in a way that really sort of pulls at my nostalgic heartstrings. that was how you felt, as if you
Yeah.
met a girl or a boy you liked. If you were,
Yeah.
you well, can I write to you? As sort of the sort of charming first way of approaching it.
So although his writing style is incredibly sophisticated for a 15-year-old when he wrote that song, the subject matter is sort of pleasingly childlike, or certainly teenager-like.
Yeah.
I mean, you've referred to it as deeply romantic in many ways.
Well, it is.
Yeah.
I think a lot of this album is romantic, not necessarily as in romance with a, a girlfriend or anything.
Yeah.
It's just romantic, as in, its outlook on life is sort of, you can feel that this is a writer who observes and looks and watches and cares deeply about what he sees, and I love that album for it.
And it can be romantic in a kind of nostalgic sense as well.
Yes.
I mean, you mentioned the fact that he knew he was going to be leaving his hometown of East Kilbride. Lots of and that sense of, as you said, of leaving and perhaps loss, and a loss of innocence maybe, and having to grow up, and all these sort of things are at play as he writes these songs. But it's deeply heartfelt and moving, a lot of it, I find. I want to talk a bit about, we touched on it a bit, but the Spanish guitar, which, oh God, it adds such incredible texture to so many of the songs on this album. So you get it on Oblivious, you get it on Release. We'll talk about Release a bit later as well, because that's one of these tracks that starts in one place and builds and goes to a completely different place, by the way. You get the Spanish guitar a bit on We Could Send Letters. But I want to pick out the galloping drama that is the end of Lost Outside the Tunnel. It just absolutely fires you to the end of this track with this incredible, frenetic, urgent Spanish guitar solo. And as the track finished, I just wanted to shout out, "Ole!"
But also it isn't just that they sort of start on it, but there is hook upon hook upon hook that he writes. Just when you think, in the Boy Wonders, just when you think you've heard all the hooks that there's going to be, you've suddenly got the Highland Hard Rain chant comes in.
Yeah.
I mean, perhaps we should talk about Release, because that starts somewhere.
Yeah.
Quite quiet with a sort of jazzy guitar opening. He was a big admirer of a jazz guitarist called Wes Montgomery.
Okay.
And he was sort of, I think, mimicking a little bit of his style. He's an incredible student of music, Roddy. And then it just builds and builds. And just when you think it's gone somewhere, it's suddenly taking on, it's gone up another level, and it's got the most ferocious end to it. It's so incredibly mature as a piece of music that, again, we go back to, he's sort of 17 and a half when he's in the studio.
It's unbelievable. I mean, I love that track. It's one of my favorites, Release. And it starts, it starts in quite a quiet, stripped back way. And it reminds me, again, one of my pieces of further listening, I think, will be to explore some of his solo work later in his career. But I am familiar with the track Small World, which was used on one of my favorite comedy shows, Early Doors, in the sort of early 2000s. So 20 years after this. But the start of Release reminds me a bit of that more kind of grown up, thoughtful, wistful approach. But then, as you say, it goes somewhere completely different, that track. I like some of I like the writing throughout, but there's a lovely line in this, "Bottle merchants, both of us," which I really like. And this insistent vocal of his, it's insistent without being sort of harsh. It's somehow really endearing, his vocal, and again, quite particular to him, I think.
It has the kind of phrasing of Elvis Costello without the sneer. they go and they support Elvis Costello in the States.
Okay. Yeah.
I think round about now, though, they go off and they go and do that.
Another of the themes I think through the album is this kind of uber sadness, almost a sense of giving up. So a few tracks I'd touch on here. There's one called "The Bugle Sounds Again." I mean, even the title of that could just be, you know, a headline, couldn't it? It could just be a rallying call to the lost and lonely, and like, you know, everything's gone wrong. So not only has my partner left me, I've lost my job, this has happened, and now I've knocked the milk off the side. I'm going to start saying it round the house because it. Oh, there we go. Of course, the bugle sounds again.
That's how you felt the world was, just when you thought you'd got it under control. You haven't. You know, the bugle sounds again, and off it goes. Interestingly, apparently that song was originally going to be called Soul Boy, which I don't know how it was then changed. But the bugle bit was an idea that was given to him by Edwyn Collins, his label mate from Orange Juice. And he uses it again on the next album to burn down the banks while the bugles played on The Birth of the True. So it's I mean, it's not a song you know, apart from the Andrews Sisters going the boogie woogie bugle boy of Company B, I can't think of many popular songs in which the bugle has featured.
That's easy for you to say.
There he is with two of them, you know. So
yeah. And also on that track, I found myself, certainly the first time I heard it, I found myself thinking I would love to hear this really stripped back to just voice and piano. I think it would make a gorgeous version of it.
So many of his later concerts and gigs, he does strip back versions of all his favorites.
Who's the keyboard player on this album?
Bernie Clark.
Bernie
who's
Clark,
also he's also he's the half co-producer.
Yeah.
And in fact, he has an incredible piece of organ playing on Back on Board.
Yeah, another of my favourite tracks, and another one that falls into that category, I think, of careworn. What is the point in life? I've just given up. That's another one. As is the final. I mean, Back on Board is the penultimate track on the album, but as is the final track, Down the Dip, and the two almost link because Back on Board, we'll talk about it in a minute, but Back on Board at the end sort of fades to this just.
Yes,
you think you're still in it. It fades to this just lovely little guitar intro to Down the Dip, and the first time you hear it, it took me by surprise. Like, I thought I'm in this one thing, and all of a sudden I'm in this other thing. But all of those three tracks, The Bugle Sounds Again, Back on Board, and Down the Dip, they all have this sense of, what's the point? I've just given up. And I'm really drawn to music like that. But I'm going to go back to Back on Board, because it's another one like Release that starts in one place and then goes through the gears. I mean, it goes through it doesn't wind up in a relentless gallop like some of the tracks do. It just moves on. It's
layer upon layer upon layer, and it just goes and just moves, like you said, moves up the gears.
Yeah, through the gears of melancholy in this one. It's because you get a lot of lovely organ that you've mentioned there. You get a bit of harmonica. It just finishes up.
It's very soulful. It's very soulful.
You think it sounds to me like a sort of heart-rending country and western song. Those real tear-jerking country and western songs, you would get what sounds like a gospel choir at the end as well. I mean, I love that.
You know, please listen to Ray Charles's Modern Sounds in Country and Western, and you'll know exactly what I'm talking about.
Oh God, I may well do.
Which is an amalgam of both.
This notion of tracks that start in one place and build and go to a different place. We've spoken about Release. We've spoken about Back on Board. We should probably also touch on Lost Outside the Tunnel in that regard as well. That's always felt to be, because he was listening to a lot of music, and that's always felt to be the one that
has elements of what were seen as some of those Liverpool bands, which
Okay.
was Echo and the Bunnymen,
Oh
Teardrop
yeah,
Explodes.
yeah,
You talked a little bit about having the Cure in there. It is, I mean, it's one of the angstiest of the songs
Mhm.
on the album. Lost Outside Myself. It's sort of outside a group. It's very much, I am on the outside of things.
Yeah,
And again, that whole thing of leaving and moving on, and
yeah.
it's all part of that.
If I think of myself as a 17-year-old, which came a few years later, but maybe we'll have to do a 1989 because that's my annus mirabilis, if you like, in that
Okay,
in that thing. But
I'll get the Kylie out.
what? Not the Stone Roses, but Kylie. Um, yeah, you do. There's a lot of that goes on. It's a little bit teen angsty, isn't it? It's kind of, oh, I don't belong. There's this. I've just started reading Jean-Paul
Yeah.
Sartre. There's this whole sense of anomie and all
Yeah,
that.
and yet I love listening to it, and yet
Yeah,
it doesn't. He manages to do all of it without ever grating.
yeah.
I don't. There's never a moment where it just becomes a bit arch, and I'm going, oh yeah, no, you've just swallowed a bit of, you've just been reading a bit of Kafka.
It's quite light touch. I forget
Yeah,
I forget which track it is on this album, but he mentions about overdosing on Keats or something, and it's just in
yeah,
passing. He
yeah,
doesn't he doesn't sort of make a big meal of it. It's just
yeah.
en passant. It's really
Whereas if you compare it to an album, Rattlesnakes, which is the Lloyd Cole
yeah,
album, which I absolutely adore,
yeah,
and I know is one of your particular favorites,
yeah,
which is one of the reasons I chose this, thinking you would like it. I always think with Lloyd Cole, he wants you to know that he's well read,
for sure. Yeah,
whereas I think this is I'm well read and I'll kind of use it, but I'm not here to tell you that. So it is a softer, like as you say, a lighter touch, I think.
yeah. No, I mean with Lloyd Cole, I mean we're not here to talk about Lloyd Cole, although as you say, he's probably the first Lloyd Cole and the Commotions, my first big musical influence, the first act I really got into hugely. I remember having a tape done by a boy at school. I paid him the princely sum of £1, I think, to do me both mainstream and easy pieces, and I just listened to those things time and time again. But you're right, Lloyd was very much see how clever I am. But no, you don't get that with Roddy. There's clearly an overlap there, but as I say, Roddy's much lighter touch, and actually the literary stuff and the political stuff, it's there. But in that interview where he said he wasn't that comfortable writing about political stuff, he almost, I forget what words he used, but I'm paraphrasing him to say that he's more comfortable writing about this deeply personal, emotional stuff than he was writing about politics. But
Interesting.
yeah,
Um, I just want to touch on because
mm,
not a lot of this album was terribly successful. The album went on to do quite well. Oblivious, I think, made about number 18 in the charts,
mm,
but it had sold a lot because that was a reissue. That was a Warner's reissue
right.
of the original single. But actually, released before it was, I think, one of the highlights of the album, which is Walk Out to Winter.
Hmm.
A different version is released as a single. He
Okay.
sings it on his own. It doesn't have a sort of double vocal on it. And that again has a lovely Johnny Marr influence. And I'm still absolutely amazed why that was never a hit, because that is an
Mm,
absolutely astonishing song. I always thought it was a bit like it was a sort of a seasonal relationship,
yeah.
but actually it's nothing to do with that at all. Apparently it's to do with the death of punk, which it
Uh,
is there. The faces of Strummer fell from the wall.
yeah. I
Which
wrote that
is
down. I like
which
that line as well. Yeah, it's grand.
Yeah, but he was a big fan of the Clash. He later go on and record with Mick Jones on Good Morning Britain.
Yeah.
Um, and I've never quite understood why it just wasn't more successful, or just somebody went back 3 years later and said we're reissuing it because it's just
Mm.
so good. But
You mentioned that Marr and Smith's influence again, which you definitely hear in that jangly guitar in Walk Out to Winter. And I think you can't underestimate how if indeed he was an influence on Johnny Marr, as Noel Gallagher has pointed out, not everyone can do that. You're a weird so and so Johnny Marr, not because very few people can play the guitar like that. But
Yeah,
clearly, Roddy Frame was one of them. And if he's gone on to influence Johnny Marr, then what a feat!
indeed. I mean, and it's there on all of them, probably with the exception of Down the Dip, which we haven't really talked about, which I think is really it feels like a Billy Bragg-ish
It's
kind of song. It's got that element to it, that sort of
it's
slightly folky acoustic.
yeah, got a protest song almost, isn't it? Although it's not
Yeah,
a protest song, it's got that feel
no,
to it.
because the
Um,
dip was the Diplomat pub in East
yes,
Kilbride. It was
I read
basically
that.
let's go down to the pub.
Because when I first heard it, and I have to say about that track, the last track on the album was probably on my first listen or two to this album was probably my favorite track. I felt like I got it so quite quickly, but I had assumed, perhaps wrongly, that the lyric was like, oh, we're going downhill together, we're going to hell in a handcart, all of that stuff, and I thought it was quite a nice way of expressing that, down the dip. But no, it seems that it was actually
No,
referring to, so perhaps it was another nostalgic kind of plea to
no.
be back there in happier
Oh,
times. I don't know.
yeah, where stupidity and suffering are on that ticket too.
What a great line again.
Lovely.
Yeah.
I mean, but it's interesting. He has that sort of lovely guitar picking sound, which is
Yes.
interesting because his next album goes on to be produced by Mark Knopfler.
Ah, right.
Some people always viewed that slightly as commercial suicide,
Hmm.
and yet I can't help but think that he was one of the people who realised that Mark Knopfler is one of the great guitarists, and clearly that was what drew him to it. He had heard that Mark Knopfler had produced Bob Dylan's Joker Man,
Hmm.
or the Infidels album,
Hmm.
and he wanted to sound like that on the next album. So it's there, and of
I mean,
course,
I wouldn't say necessarily it's commercial suicide. It might be in inverted commas, indie suicide.
well,
Going,
it was, but it also it meant that the indie audience didn't necessarily come over with him when by the time the second album came out, which is a great shame because it's a good album. It doesn't have the same commercial
is it
success,
is it
or is it critical? And it doesn't have the
right?
critical success.
Is
It's
it
almost
more?
like everybody went, Mark Knopfler's on this, that it can't be. You are no longer,
Yeah.
you can no longer wear your suede jacket and be an old gang anymore.
This is
So
indie snobbery writ large, though, isn't it? You see it all the
and
time.
I think of all the bands, they're the ones that possibly suffered the most from it.
Mm.
Which is a great shame.
But
And they were
and
a pop band.
yeah.
You listen to From Pillar to Post,
Oh, yeah.
because we haven't really talked about that, but we
Yeah.
should just quickly
Yeah.
put this
Yeah.
story
Yeah.
on the, you know, Pillar to Post is, I think, quite Morrissey-esque, and for me, it's like a Motown record. It starts like a Motown record. It's got that
Mm. Yeah.
kind of thing, and bang. They had been on postcard the sound of young Scotland, and
Yeah.
Motown is the sound of young America, and I think that's it. It's a terrific song. That is another one that had been a single that had flopped.
That's interesting. You should say that you think it's like a Motown single. I hadn't thought about that until you mentioned it, but I can absolutely see it now. The thing that I fixated on was the start of that, where you get that sort of very hard guitar sound, but it really reminded me of Bowie's China Girl.
I know exactly what you mean, but
Yeah.
I went, oh, it sounds like the start to a Motown record. So
Then it races in quite quickly with the chorus, doesn't it?
yeah.
Yeah. But you're right. So those, what was it? I could be happy in happy extremes. What's the lyric from that
Yeah,
song?
that's it. I could be happy in happy extremes.
Yeah,
Sounds
which
very Morrissey, doesn't
Morrissey
it?
definitely could have written that.
I'm going to say before, because I think we've probably covered all the songs now, but
Yeah.
the only thing with From Pillar to Post is it has the one thing that has made sure this is never a 10 out of 10 for me. And it's what dates it, is that it had synth drums on it. It has those terrible hexagonal drum pads that were that sort of boom, and it just has. And I know if you was to re-record it now, the first thing you'd take out
Yeah.
but it's the only thing, and it's just it dates it because that was what you did. It isn't.
Yeah.
It isn't throughout the record, but it was used a little bit. And I always think it's the one thing that just makes you just go, just wish they hadn't done that.
It's what I like to refer to, because I hadn't really heard that. Again, I'd have to listen to it again, see if I can pick out those synth drum sounds. But the way you describe it there, that sort of boo boo, is what I refer to as Pigeon Street drums. People of a certain age who watch the kids' show Pigeon Street, probably a year or two after this, I would say, will know what I mean. The boo 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 was the sound of the pigeons on Pigeon Street. So we're
very good.
We're not here for the Pigeon Street drums.
And weirdly, just to say, great drumming on the album, which is by Dave Ruffy, who used to be in the Ruts.
Yeah. Is that a weird career progression?
Well, you'll find he goes on to do all sorts of things. But yeah, no, that's where he was.
We should also name check, because we haven't done, bassist Campbell Owens.
Well done, Campbell.
Yes.
It's only these are the only two albums really where they are a band.
Yeah, okay.
Basically, it goes on and it becomes a solo enterprise really after that.
Yeah, I mentioned the bass on We Could Send Letters. There's a bit of it that sounds a bit curie. And then there's another bit when I first heard the track where the song starts and then you get this rather disorienting bass sound. So a really jarring bass sound. That was the first thing I noticed about that track, actually. So yeah, it's so rich.
So all in all, you enjoyed the Minstrel Troubadour.
I enjoyed the Minstrel Troubadour of East Kilbride very much indeed.
Yeah.
Before we wrap up, we should talk briefly about the tidbit at the start of the show.
Please do.
So other albums that are named after the lyric of a song that's not the title of that song, the track from the album. I think you had one or two of these, did you?
I would give you Diamond Life by Sade, which features in Smooth Operator, I think.
Okay.
All right.
So you got your Sade one. Well, it struck me that the Wonder Stuff was the masters of this. You could say their first three albums. So Eight-Legged Groove Machine, their debut album, is actually a lyric from the track Grin. Hup, their second album, is definitely a lyric from Don't Let Me Down Gently. And Never Loved Elvis is a lyric from Mission Drive. So this is obviously a bit of a thing for Wonder Stuff.
A bit of a thing for them. Oh, how about Making Movies by Dire Straits?
Oh,
which is from Skate Away. Making movies on location.
Very good.
There we go.
It all links. It all links back to Knopfler.
Now, I believe you like to give these things a mark.
I do, but since our first meeting at the Twilight Turntable, I realised I'm going to need a scoring system with more calibration. Not that I've been overthinking this at all.
Beta query plus query.
Very much so. It needs more calibration. I gave the Kinks at Face to Face 7 out of 10. I was toying with giving it an 8, but I gave it a 7 to give myself a bit of headroom for future. And I'm going to need that headroom. Okay, so we're going to go to a percentage-based scoring system. And the Kinks Face to Face is getting an upgrade to 77%.
Oh,
a truly brilliant album, and easily a first in university terms. No queries involved in that. And similarly, this is a truly brilliant album, which is also going to get a first. Doesn't quite reach Kinks levels though. 71% for Highland Hard Rain.
Okay.
Still a
first.
Good. You know, to get something in the 90s. It's going to have to be up there with The Queen Is Dead or Rubber Soul. You know what I mean? So I need to leave myself that room. But anything over 50%, I've enjoyed. You know, so in the 70s, both these albums I've reviewed so far.
Highlight for you?
I was really hoping you wouldn't ask me that because I found it really difficult because it's uniformly brilliant, this album.
It is, isn't it?
But if you ask me today, and I will say Back on Board.
Good choice.
Yeah.
Good choice.
But I could have picked half a dozen, Tone.
Yeah, I think so. I'd probably go for Walk Out to Winter, but I think I prefer the single version. So I may go the Bugle Sounds again.
Oh, see, that's lovely. Yeah, I must seek out the single version of Walk Out to Winter. Didn't realise it was different.
And there's an extended version actually, which is nice as well. I will give you some further listening.
Thank you
Obviously,
very
the
much.
other Aztec albums, Aztec Camera albums are really good.
Yeah.
I like them all. I never have quite the affection for them that I do for this one, but possibly one of the best songs he ever wrote is on Love, which is the third album called Killamont Street, and I would advise anybody to listen to that.
Okay.
But also, if you want some further listening in this genre, is Orange Juice, who were their label mates on Postcard.
Yes,
And
please.
they're, in fact, all of their albums, there's only 4 of those,
Yeah.
are well worth listening to. Very enjoyable, and I think that would be some good further listening. But there's lots and lots that was coming out of Scotland in this period.
Yeah.
All of which I'm sure in later turntables we may yet come back.
Well, I'm certainly going to go and explore a bit of Orange Juice, a band I've sort of admired from afar, if you like, but never lifted the bonnet properly. So that's definitely a good one. So thanks, Tone.
Paul, it's been a pleasure. What little I've had, I've enjoyed.
Always fantastic. And I can't wait for the next one.
See you next time.
Cheerio. We'll see you next time at the Twilight Turntable,
Where we'll be trying to change the world one late night long player at a time. Please try listening.